genel izleyici kitlesi için uygundur.
Saat Farkı'ndan merhabalar. Her hafta farklı ülkelerden, farklı milletlerden konuklarla bölgesel, küresel meselelere dair farklı perspektiflere yer vermeye çalışıyoruz. Bu hafta İstanbul'da stüdyoda çok kıymetli bir konuğumuz var, özel bir konuğumuz var. Michigan eyaleti, ABD'den Anayasa Mahkemesi Yargıcı Richard Bernstein bizlerle. Kendisi İstanbul'da, Türkiye'de bazı görüşmeler için burada bulunuyor. Hem ziyaretinin sebeplerini soracağız. Kendisi aynı zamanda ABD'de aslında hem Michigan Eyaleti Anayasa Mahkemesi'nin hem de aslında ABD genelindeki ilk görme engelli yargıç. Bu anlamda biraz kendisinin ABD'deki deneyimini de konuşacağız. Biraz yargı meselelerini, ABD'de yargıyı ilgilendiren çeşitli meseleleri de konuşacağız kendisiyle. Justice Bernstein, welcome. It's an honor to meet you. Thank you very much for coming here.
I love your program, and I have to tell you, I love you. You have the best energy and spirit and vitality, and it's just a pleasure to know you and a pleasure to be with you.
I'm humbled to hear that. Thank you so much, sir. Well, welcome to Istanbul. Let me ask you first, before we go into other topics, what brought you to Turkey?
So I'm here in Turkey. We're basically doing a tour to help people with disabilities, to give them a better life and create more opportunities. But I have to say, this city is without a question the greatest city in the world. I have never experienced a place as remarkable as Istanbul, and I have never come to a place where the people are as friendly and as kind and as warm as the Turkish people are. And I just have to really emphasize this. For everybody who's watching, you should be so proud of your country and your heritage and your warmth and your kindness and your ability to welcome people. And you should be so proud of the magnificence of this city. I will have to say, I have traveled to cities all across the world. This is by far the most magnificent, most beautiful, most cosmopolitan place I have ever had a chance to visit. So I'm hoping that and I'm hoping that you'll have me back, because I'm in love with Istanbul, and I'm in love with Turkey, and I'm in love with all the people.
So this is the first visit, but I hope it's not gonna be the last one. So
let me tell you something. I really,
this is only the beginning,
love
hopefully.
it here.
Justice Bernstein, I also want to ask, because you are the first blind justice to the Michigan Supreme Court, and also I think in the broader U.S. you are the first and only, if I'm not wrong. So before I'm gonna also ask you, was it hard to get in there? But let me first ask you, how is your experience in that regard in Istanbul compared to other cities in the world? Because you said it's a very metropolitan city in terms of people with disabilities. How is your experience in Istanbul? Could you please share your insight with us?
Absolutely. I think it's a little bit of a challenge for people with disabilities. But listen, the city's thousands of years old. I mean, it's the cradle of civilization. So, it's an older city. So as a result, I think it's hard to modify it to make it accessible for people with disabilities. So I do think there are some challenges with accessibility, but here's the beautiful thing. The people here make up for it. So even if, let's say, the sidewalk is inaccessible, or there's a lot of steps, or it's difficult to navigate, you can always rely on a person who's going to be there to be helpful and who's going to be there to assist you. There are always people who will assure that you're going to be okay and get to where you have to go. So even though the city itself has some physical challenges, the people make up for it.
I see. So you're a strong advocate for, of course, disabled rights in your country, in the United States, and also in Michigan.
Yes.
Could you also share with us, as I said, you're the first and only, was it hard to get in
to the
that
Supreme
position?
Court?
And also after that, before and after, what are the challenges that you face and you have been facing maybe still?
Absolutely. So in Michigan, we are elected to the court. So it's an election. And there's about 11 million people in Michigan. And if you wish to serve on the state's highest court, you have to be elected by the vast majority of the state. And I'm really proud to say that the people of Michigan elected me once in 2014, and then they re-elected me again just a couple months ago. And I think what it shows is that people are open to disability. People are open to blindness. People realize that if you have a severe disability like myself, that it ultimately makes you resilient. It makes you strong. It gives you passion. It gives you purpose. So sometimes those people who have to live with struggle are able to serve better because they have a greater understanding, a greater appreciation, and a heightened sensitivity to the struggles and difficulties that people have to contend and face every day who come before us.
So are there any other types of challenges that you are facing on your position? Do you think you're an inspiration to others?
Well, I will
because
say,
it's, to be honest, a little bit surprising for me that not the fact that you are the first, but you are still the only one who has disabilities and on a Supreme Court level. So what are the other challenges maybe people are facing?
So here's what is very interesting. People always ask, I mean, if you're blind, how can you be on your state's highest court? I mean, you can't see people's faces, you can't see their expressions. How do you appreciate evidence? You know, how does all this work as a blind person? How do you function in this capacity? How do you function in this manner if you're not able to see those who are coming before you? You know, how do you actually do it? And I would answer back by saying this way, that blind people actually make the best judges. And the reason that we make the best judges is because the inability to see basically does not allow for us to be prejudiced. Because what does prejudice mean in English? It means prejudge. And so when you're blind, you can't prejudge people because you can't see them. And if you can't see them, you're not able to have a level of prejudice about how they look or how they dress or
what color they are.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think blindness eliminates that distraction and ultimately allows you to focus on the facts and the person in a greater sense. But this is the challenge with the job. I have to memorize every Wednesday, we have something called conference. And when we go to conference, there's usually about 25 cases that we're responsible for. And it deals with everything that you could imagine, murder, rape, whatever you could imagine, we're having to deal with it. So people say, as a blind person, you know, do you use Braille? Well, you can't use Braille because if I give you one textbook page, you're gonna give me 65 Braille pages. Then people say, well, do you use technology? Well, you can't use technology because if I'm listening to my computer, I can't participate in the conversation. So you know what I do? Right. I memorize all 25 cases every week. And we're a common law system. So I have to learn all the cases that correspond. There's cases that support my position, and there's cases that work against my position. And I learn all of those cases, not word for word, but enough so that when the commissioner says, okay, justices, we are now on case 18. Case 18 is a carjacking that resulted in 2 homicides. When I hear carjacking and 2 homicides, that's my mental trigger, and I'm able to recall the case in its entirety and be able to debate and discuss the case with my colleagues and hopefully persuade them to vote in a way that I believe is just.
Wow.
You gotta want it, right? 25 cases, gotta memorize all of them, gotta learn all the common law.
So you have pretty strong memory, huh?
You have a strong passion to do the work as well as possible because you know that people are counting on you and you have to get it right because these are people's entire lives that are hanging in the balance.
Yeah. Justice Bernstein, you touched upon a very, very important topic. Mainly prejudice is really important. You say blind people are best justices in that sense because they don't have. Well, there's a saying, justice is blind, isn't it? So I think, and your motto is blind justice. Justice is blind is perfectly,
exactly.
Really, literally.
Exactly. That is my motto, is blind justice.
Justice truly blind in the U.S., sir?
I think that's a fabulous question. I think, listen, I think the system works as best as it can, but I do think there's a lot of arbitrariness, and I do think that we sometimes do have a lot of wrongful convictions. And that's something that my office works incredibly hard on, is trying to ensure that if people are spending their life in prison, that they actually merit that response, that they're actually guilty of the crime that they are being charged of. So I do think that we have a really good system, but I don't think it's perfect. And I think you have to make sure that you have judges that are really on top of it and making sure that if something doesn't look right or doesn't sound right or doesn't add up, that you act on it and act on it appropriately to ensure that justice really is served upon people. But listen, we're not perfect. And there's a lot of folks who are wrongfully convicted. And those are the kind of things that you have to watch out for.
I also want to ask you, Justice Bernstein, well, there are lots of topics I would like to talk to you.
Yeah, that's why this is a great show.
Judiciary
That's why
in the
I'm
US
enjoying
especially.
this.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I also want to ask you, trust in US institutions, including judiciary, is at record low according to some polls, including Gallup's recent poll.
Sure.
I want to ask you, what are the reasons, do you think? Because it's a very, independent judiciary and rule of law are the most important things, key opponents for the democracy.
Yes.
So I want to ask you this mistrust in the US. What are the reasons and how to tackle with this, do you think?
Well, I think what is important to point out is that the judiciary does rank higher than the other two branches. So in the polling, it does come up in a better way than does the Congress or does the executive branch. So we are the highest, so people do have a certain level and degree of trust within us. And I think that is because people do see that judges do the best that they can to follow the law and to get it right as best as possible. That doesn't mean that we're perfect. So I think what you're really alluding to is the fact that sometimes people might see the courts as being political and acting in a political manner. That's something we have to guard against, because that can be a huge problem. If people start to see that the judiciary is an extension of the political process, then that will violate our separation of powers. And that's something that we're mindful of. But I think if you look at the judiciary, the vast, vast, vast majority of judges really do an outstanding job, really do the best they can to follow the law, and really do what they can to make sure that justice is really deployed.
Well, at this point, there are also, I want to mention that, I mean, U.S. Supreme Court, according to some critics, has become rapidly more polarized as the country, as the polarization in the U.S. has been increasing, and its impact on maybe judiciary is also at risk, as some people say. Especially, I think the discussions for the Supreme Court, I think, further after following the decision, the court last year voted to overrule, in terms of abortion, I want to also talk about this, overrule Roe v. Wade last year in June. So basically removing federal protections for abortion rights. So there is a very also political debate going on in the US in terms of abortion, and the elections are approaching it also. So do you think the Supreme Court has become more polarized? If yes, how did the Supreme Court become more polarized? If not, could you please explain why not?
I think that there is a number of reasons that go into it. I think that one of the big reasons would probably be just the nomination process and how justices are chosen, right? Because in Michigan, we're elected, so the voters decide, right? The people get to decide. But I think that ultimately, for the Supreme Court and for the federal system, it's done through a nomination and confirmation process. So I think what ultimately is occurring is you kind of have to look to how the different judges are chosen. And I think that on both sides, I think Republican and Democrat, I think that you're getting justices that basically, are not as independent as you used to have in the past. And I think that when you look at the selection process as it pertains to kind of how it's done, I think the parties are really emphasizing that, hey, here are the kind of things that we're searching for, here are the kind of things that we're looking for. And unfortunately, I think that's what's creating the problem, is the fact that it used to be that if one party nominated somebody, then the Senate would confirm them. Doesn't matter Republican, Democrat, right? But now I think it's gotten to a point where it's really become very challenging, where ultimately, it used to be that, hey, if the president of one party made a nomination and the Senate was controlled by the other party, the understanding was the president gets to pick and they would allow that person to go through. Now I think things have changed. It's gotten much more partisan, and I think the selection process coupled with the confirmation process, I think has made it a little bit more difficult as it pertains to how judges are ultimately being chosen.
Mm-hmm. And there are rising concerns of deeper decline of rule of law if especially Donald Trump wins second term. In that regard, do you also, let me also ask you at this point the other question that I really wonder to get your perspective, because Trump indictment also, there are some critics say that it's not a legal case, but it's politically motivated. So at this point, what are your insights on this very critical issue in the US?
Sure. So unfortunately, judges are not allowed to comment on pending litigation. So unfortunately, as much as I'd love to answer that question, the judicial canons kind of make it restrictive as to being able to do that.
So, but do you
for the wiser,
do you think there are rising concerns? Do you agree with the concerns of a deeper decline of the rule of law in the country? What do you think is the biggest threat to let's say judicial independence in the U.S. or rule of law in the U.S.? What are the biggest challenges for you?
Well, I would say in a general perspective, right, looking at it from a general way, I think that for the most part, I would say that the judiciary is held up pretty well. And, I think that where the United States currently stands is in a relatively good place. I think the judiciary has functioned, I think, throughout the number of years that we've had here. I think for the most part, the judiciary has held up. I think the rule of law has held up. I think the institutions have held up. And even though they've been challenged, I think what they have found is that the courts and the Congress, they've all been able to survive the various stress tests that they've been put under and have all been able to do pretty much okay. So I think we're in a pretty good position. And I think that the stress tests have held out. And even though there might have been threats to these institutions, they've all seemed to hold up. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but I do think that the confidence has been restored and is there.
I understand.
Yes.
We touched upon abortion. Let me ask you one question. I also personally wonder, because as the elections, general elections in 2024 approached, and one of the most defining issues is abortion, as always in the US, and some Republican candidates support a national ban on abortion. So in Michigan, in the state of Michigan, it's completely legal, as far as I know.
That's correct.
Could you tell us from a judicial perspective, is it legally possible to make a nationwide ban on abortion? And if that's the case, then what, I mean, is there anything that a Supreme Court, a state Supreme Court can do?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because ultimately it really is a states' rights issue, right? Because ultimately what the Supreme Court said when overturning Roe is that this is a question for the states. That's really what they said. They sent it back to the states and basically allowed the states to make their own determination and decisions as it pertains to abortion. So it's really a states' rights issue. Now, in Michigan, there was a referendum to our state constitution that passed overwhelmingly. So this right has now been added to the state constitution. So in Michigan, this matter has been resolved because of the statewide referendum has ultimately resolved the matter and resolved the issue. So that's Michigan. Now, other states might approach it a different way, but I can say for my state, the question as it pertains to abortion in the state of Michigan is settled law, because the people in the referendum have made it that way. And it's a part of our state constitution, and that's basically the end of it. So I think what would happen is, if something like that were to occur, is it would just go back to the states. And then each state will kind of determine its own process or its own way of dealing with it. But I can tell you what Michigan has done, and Michigan's made it very clear.
I see, and it's very one of the most defining issues, I think, for the voters
Yes.
right?
I think it's a very intense issues that voters will decide, and I think it was a very intense issue in the last election. But again, it really is a state's issue, and when you have the referendums that went through, and all the referendums that went through passed, so it's been made abundantly clear as to what the voters want and how the states are going to proceed that had these various referendums.
Well, Justice Bernstein, before we wrap up, because we have only a few
I know, but this has been such a great interview, and you make it go way too fast.
Is there any message from you that maybe you would like to highlight,
sure.
especially for people with, going back to people with disabilities?
Absolutely.
What are the, because you are a very strong advocate, and as far as I saw from the notes, you also challenged the city of New York to make Central Parks and other parks
safe and
safer for visitors. So what is your especially advice in the US? How is it going,
Sure.
and are there still things to improve?
Well,
what are your
there's always going to be things to improve, but the thing that I'm the most proud of is athletics.
Okay.
Athletics.
Yeah, you're also a
Yes.
professional, I think, athlete,
yes,
right?
I've
Aren't
completed 25 marathons, and I've also completed a full Ironman competition.
Wow.
For those who are not familiar, an Ironman is a 2.4-mile swim, followed by a 112-mile bike, to be completed by a 26.2-mile run. And the rules are simple. If you stop, if you rest, if you take a break, you run the risk of a cutoff. And if you miss a cutoff, you're going to be immediately disqualified from the competition. So I always love to paint a picture. Imagine diving into a frigid body of water. The water temperature that morning of Lake Coeur d'Alene was 55 degrees.
Wow.
Imagine swimming in darkness, getting kicked in the face by all the other swimmers, and having other swimmers get entangled in your rope. I share this story because as they get entangled, the rope becomes constrictive. And as it constricts, it starts taking you below the surface. And the harder you swim and the harder you attempt to break free, the quicker you start to get taken below the surface.
Wow.
I share this very quickly. After your 2.4-mile swim, you have your 112-mile bike. After your 112-mile bike, you have your 26.2-mile run. I share this because for people with disabilities, we might be infirmed, we might be mortal, and we might have to struggle. But what you realize when you spend time with a disabled person is we have the strongest of spirits and the most powerful of souls, and we are a resilient people. And ultimately, even though we face struggle and hardship and pain every day, it is our resilience that comes with our struggle that allows for us to accomplish and achieve what needs to be done because we simply have no other choice but to. And I like to end by saying this. Often when you do these endurance competitions, what you ultimately find is that the spirit will disconnect from the body, and with that resilience and with that strength and with that spirituality, the spirit will pierce the heavens and touch the face of God and allow for the body to follow it.
Well, I can feel that spirit. Please keep up this amazing, perfect spirit.
And please have us back here in
well, what's the next challenge for you? Are you planning to swim in the Bosphorus?
If you set up that challenge, if you set up a race, it would be my pleasure to do so.
Let's do it.
You set it up and we will make it happen.
Let's try it. Thank you so much.
Thank you
very much, Mr. Bernstein. Evet, Saat Farkı'nda bu hafta Michigan Eyaleti Anayasa Mahkemesi Yargıcı Richard Bernstein konuğumuzdu. Kendisi aynı zamanda Michigan Eyaleti'nin Anayasa Mahkemesi'ni ve aslında ABD'deki ilk ve tek hatta yüksek yargıç görme engelli. Biraz kendi deneyimini konuştuk, Türkiye ziyaretini konuştuk. ABD'deki yargıyı ilgilendiren bazı konuları, yargıya özellikle azalan güveni, yaklaşan seçimleri, kutuplaşmayı biraz bu konuları da konuşmaya çalıştık. Önümüzdeki hafta yine farklı bir konuyla, farklı bir konukla görüşmek dileğiyle. Hoşça kalın.